So, we've been establishing the biblical foundation for Christian civil disobedience in the last couple of episodes. But I think we now have to talk about exactly what that looks like for Christians. What does Christian resistance actually look like? In 2020, we've seen a lot of this kind of thing going on, lots of looting, burning, and violence and so on. But Christian resistance, well, it looks a bit different to this. So let's get into it. The main point of differentiation is that Christian protest must always be non-sinful. Very simply, we cannot protest sin by sinning ourselves. When the early church was being persecuted for following God rather than human authority, Peter wrote, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the world. If you're insulted because you bear the name of Christ, you will be blessed, for the glorious Spirit of God rests upon you. If you suffer, however," and this is the key part, "if you suffer, however, it must not be for murder, stealing, making trouble, or prying into other people's affairs. But it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian. Praise God for the privilege of being called by his name." So in other words, if we are to suffer, if we are to be persecuted as a Christian, then if it's for merely practicing our faith in peace, then there's no shame in that. But it cannot be because we are sinning ourselves. In other words, we can't defend the moral law by ourselves breaking the moral law. We can't bear witness to Jesus by doing things that Jesus has explicitly forbidden. We can't defend the Bible by breaking the Bible's instructions. You see what I mean? Therefore, our resistance to the government must never involve sin. The bottom line here then is that Christian resistance never involves stealing, looting, burning businesses, violence, lying, stirring up trouble, tearing down statues, attacking the police, or indeed innocent people on the streets, or indeed anything of that nature, any other sin. Christian protest must always be peaceful protest. And there's a second reason why peaceful protest is just a good idea anyway, and that's because it's more powerful, it's more effective, and it wins more hearts and minds. The morning after George Floyd was killed, in that moment you'll remember, the immediate reaction of the whole world was to unite in sympathy. And understandably so, this terrible thing had happened and the whole world was in shock. And in that moment they were ready to listen and to try to understand. Now of course Black Lives Matter quickly took ownership of the whole narrative, and for a little while, again driven by sympathy, people did listen to that organisation. But do you know when people began losing their sympathy for Black Lives Matter, and when they became hardened and more suspicious of the whole thing? It's when they started rioting and looting and burning businesses. That's when they lost a lot of support. And that's when people began saying, hang on a second, let's dig deeper into what Black Lives Matter actually represents, because this doesn't look good. And of course we quickly discovered that they wanted to tear down Western civilization, capitalism, the family, and so forth. But again, what hardened people to Black Lives Matter in the first place was simply the manner of their protest, the violence, the looting, and so forth. In fact, even watching these scenes now, this doesn't win me over to their cause. It hardens me to their cause. I'm sure it's the same for many of you too. This is actually very counterproductive. So we as Christians should protest peacefully, first of all because the Bible commands it, there's no room for sin in our protests, and secondly because it's just more effective. By staying respectful, we will actually win respect from the people that see us. By remaining dignified, polite, and peaceful, even as we resist, is what God wants from us as his representatives, and it's just what will have the biggest impact. Remember how dignified Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were as they offered their resistance to King Nebuchadnezzar. They simply kept standing when everyone else around them was bowing down. That in itself has resonance for us today, of course. But remember how respectful they were as they spoke to the king. They said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you have set up." They refer to Nebuchadnezzar repeatedly as Your Majesty, giving him due respect and honour as the king, as they should. They're not violent either. They just politely but very firmly let it be known that they are not going to obey this immoral law. The same thing is seen with Daniel and the apostles too. And of course, these are our role models in such things. Like them, we must resist firmly, but with due honour, respect and dignity. We must do it in as peaceful a way as possible. Let's get specific then. What does Christian civil disobedience look like? How can we protest or express our will or voice in the face of growing encroachment and tyranny? Let's take a look at some specific examples. Number one, the main thing is to continue practicing your faith regardless of what the government says. That's the example we get from Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the apostles, and I'm delighted to hear that many churches in the UK are indeed doing this now. I've just been reading that although the government has made meetings illegal here in the UK right now, many churches are indeed continuing to meet in secret. One anonymous pastor says, "We've been holding clandestine services since this lockdown began. It feels weird for us to act this way. People have said it feels more like an underground church in China. The fact that we have to sneak around to worship God in fear of criminal prosecution is alarming, but we do what we have to do. I never thought I'd say this in Britain, but churches are going underground." Good on you. That's exactly what we need right now. Continue practicing your faith no matter what. Number two, refuse to obey immoral laws. If the government demands something immoral of you, something against your conscience, simply do not do it. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if the government tries to get you to bow against your conscience, simply keep standing. Number three, don't obey restrictions on thought and speech either. Increasingly in our time, there are penalties for free speech. There are penalties for speaking biblical truth in public, but we must keep speaking it to the world anyway, no matter what. That's the example we get from the apostles. They were told to stop preaching the word in public, but the angel came and broke them out of jail and told them to keep doing it anyway. That's our example. That's our command too. There's a reason that tyrannical governments always sooner or later come for the Bible and try to ban it. And it's because the words of the Bible are so powerful and engender freedom in those who hear them. As Horace Greeley said, it is impossible to enslave mentally or socially a Bible-reading people. The principles of the Bible are the groundwork of human freedom. So keep speaking biblical truth at all times, no matter what. Number four, we can boycott companies who promote an immoral or anti-Christian agenda. Now, I'm not sure how big the Christian dollar or pound or euro actually is these days, and if it's big enough to make a difference to large companies, but we know that there's really just one way to get through to them, and that's to affect their bottom line somehow. Many companies these days are going woke because they think it's going to improve their profits. They think it's to their advantage to do this. We should do what we can to make sure that they're not rewarded for it, by us at least. An example of this strategy working really well in the past is the Sugar Boycott in the 1800s. People stopped buying sugar produced by slaves in a bid to diminish the profitability of the slave trade and therefore help to end it. We should just choose wisely which companies benefit from our spending and which ones don't. Number five, we can attend marches and protests. Again, remember, no violence, no burning, no looting, but with dignity and respect, we can let our voices be heard on the streets. We can also do prayer walks in the community so that we are visible. We can also bring a theme to it so that people know what we represent, maybe a clothing theme. My man Jonathan Isaac was recently doing a prayer walk in Orlando called Hold Up the Lights, where people walked around the city praying and holding up lights. I'm a big fan of that idea, it's very symbolic. But either way, just taking it to the streets is a time-honoured way of letting our voices be heard. And remember, you'll be far more effective if, as you do this, you meet people with a smile on your face, you give them respect and dignity, you show kindness and compassion. It'll just be far more effective if you love people as you go about it. And indeed, when people compare the Christian way of doing this with what they've seen from Black Lives Matter this year, it's going to be clear from our conduct which side is on the right side of history. Number six, you can also do public worship events. In Estonia, in the late 80s, hundreds of thousands of Estonians gathered and literally just sang for 5 straight nights to protest against Soviet rule. They also formed a human chain across the entire country. It became known as the Singing Revolution, and just a few years later, they gained their freedom from the Soviet bloc. And then a final example, and there are many more things you can do beyond this, but a final example is writing letters to your local representatives. I've heard reliably that this is one of the most effective ways to make your voice heard. If you can get every Christian in your area to write to your local MP and to do it repeatedly, and that's the key thing, they soon get the picture from the flood of messages coming into their inbox, the strength of the feeling, and they understand that they better act on this or they're going to lose their job at the next election. So apparently the trick here is don't write long letters, because if they're too long they probably won't get read, but it's the quantity that matters here. So just a line or two saying we expect you to defend our freedom, we expect you to act, and if you don't, you've lost a vote. And if you can get every Christian you know to do that and to do it repeatedly, then it's the volume that might prompt the change. And of course, you can also start petitions as well. That's another effective thing that you can do. So those are just some examples. The first three are the most important ones though. Keep practicing your faith at all costs, refuse to obey immoral laws, and keep speaking the truth no matter what. That's really the bedrock of our freedom right there, and we simply can't give way on any of those.